Hey guys, so in the last video we talked about a little bit what a democratic wave would look like with regards to the map here. And this video I want to focus on a little bit more about how that, could happen or how that would happen. I think that the main way that this would happen is that, when you look at how historically wave elections have broken, they tend to break when the incumbent president is extremely unpopular, as was President Trump. He was about -8, -9 points on election day in 2018, and that bled over to the House popular vote. Conversely, right now, we see President Biden being relatively popular at a net 14-point approval rating. And, every president enjoys their honeymoon period. Generally will enjoy the best results of their presidency around this time. However, it's definitely possible that this could prove enduring. President Biden won election with about 51% of the vote. He has a decent approval rating now that could endure, especially if I would say the Democrats do not overreach and do anything that is wildly unpopular to the American populace. And provided that many of the bills that he's currently working on end up passing and that they end up maintaining their high levels of approval. In the Republican wave scenario, I talked about how the 2009 stimulus bill, went from very popular, although not as popular as we're currently seeing with this bill, but popular nonetheless, to being relatively unpopular and viewed as unsuccessful by the American electorate. That kind of doomed the Democrats when combined with perceived or actual overreach by congressional Democrats in the first term of the or first midterm election cycle of the Obama presidency. But here we see that wide margins of approval for the COVID relief bill, 66 to 25%, with pretty widespread bipartisan approval and very high levels of approval among independents and Democrats. You see individual aspects of that bill, including the direct stimulus checks, the minimum wage, and the vaccine programs, all being very popular. Some more so than others, like the minimum wage being a little bit less popular, relatively speaking, but still popular nonetheless. And I would say that if you see that translate over into the generic congressional vote, people decide to punish the Republicans for voting, as we saw this past Friday night, vote in masse against the bill. A solid party line vote with only 2 Democrats joining Republicans to object to the House version of the bill. If voters decide to punish Republicans for that, this could very well be a wave year. Especially if you think that if we make some kind of assumption that the only thing people care about is the stimulus bill, well, you very well could see that reflect into the generic congressional ballot. And what it would take is roughly let's say 52-53% of Democrats to vote in favor, and Republicans only get about 45% of the voters. And it's tough to see how this exactly breaks, because as we saw in 2020, they were predicting another Democratic wave year election potentially, right? Like, this was basically the same average, about half a percentage point less going into 2020 than it was in 2018. But it was a blue wave that did not break, or I should say it did break, but against the Democrats. And, but it's really tough to say. What I would speculate, and pulling up New York Times election map here, is that what we would have to see for this blue wave to materialize is a combination of a few factors that is basically the flip of what I said was the case for Republicans. What I think would need to happen is that you would have basically maintaining the Democratic coalition of 2020, which is, in my opinion, a combination of, and I think it's relatively objective, a combination of, progressives, liberals, the traditional Democratic coalition, but also the traditionally Republican-leaning suburbs and Republicans who are just dissatisfied with President Trump, including people like me who voted, a straight line Republican ticket, but did not vote for President Trump or Biden for that matter. And, basically what happens is that Democratic coalition sticks together. And at the same time, the Republican base basically fractures, at least to a certain extent. You have people like me who are, if you want to call it establishment Republican, or at the very least someone who is not on the Trump train, so to speak. People like me decide to stay home and to either not vote for Republicans or to vote, continue that suburban shift, so to speak, and end up voting for Democrats. The other thing that I think that you would potentially see is you keep the share of like the white vote, which shifted very much over to the Democrats, and in traditionally, traditional minority voters, which have traditionally favored the Democrats, they shift right back to the Democrats in 2022, which is entirely possible without Trump on the top of the ticket. Although I would caution and note that many of these congressional Republicans in both the Senate and the House did tend to outperform Trump on down ballot races. Not all of them, but in many of them. But you could totally see where, for example, let's take the state of Texas. We look at Dallas, right? Let's assume that margin stays exactly the same, but then you have in like the traditionally Hispanic Rio Grande Valley area, this shifts right back to Democrats. Same thing, maybe you have compounding this problem. You also have, the more rural working class voters that Trump helped bring into the Republican Party suddenly say, well, we don't like that Republicans have not been strong enough for President Trump. We're not going to back them. And let's say that these like shifts that we see relatively uniformly across the country to varying degrees in these rural areas, they say, we're going to stay home, or we're going to vote for a third party candidate or something like that. You could see really the seeds for a potential blue wave. Especially then if you take a look at, I do think that this is potentially compounded because of the effects of COVID, but, you take a look at some of the major urban centers, like in New York City, even in Cook County, where Chicago is located, Miami-Dade County, of course. You could potentially have, many of these voters go back to the Democratic Party, and that wouldn't be necessarily the wildest thing to see. This Brookings report from exit polls taken immediately after the election kind of shows this. We had the white margin relative to 2016 decrease in favor of, in favor of the Democrats, but we had across the boards among Black voters, Latino voters, and Asian Americans shift more towards the Republicans. That goes back to the Democrats, and you have all these other confluence of factors happen in 2022. Well, it's entirely possible that we see a map like I discussed in my previous video. Again, super early to tell, but could happen, and who knows? Other states, like, again, Florida, Iowa, Ohio, with the right candidates and perhaps the wrong candidates on the Republican side, could end up flipping for the Democrats. We'll just have to see. But for right now, it's fun to speculate and talk a little bit about the potential projections. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. Really appreciate it. And, as always, feel free to subscribe, like, comment, and let me know what you're interested in me covering. Thanks again for your support and have a good one.